Now with Shalina Ali, the co-executive director of True School, Milwaukee's Center for Transformative Creative Arts and Hip Hop Culture.
We're also joined by Pardeep Kalika. He's executive director of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee. Thank you both for joining us.
All right, guys, Dr. Marks covered a lot of ground, but what is that one takeaway from tonight's presentation that just took you beyond your own comfort zone? I'm going to start with you, Shalina.
Sure, thank you. I think really it's about the personal experience that a lot of us have lived and how those personal experiences innately drive a lot of the work that we do. Sometimes, we can talk about these subjects in such a matter-of-fact way that we even become numb to it, but just listening to it explained in such a magnificent way and laid out. And I must say he is truly an MC because he was a master of that ceremony. But just really allowing that to dig in personal in a different way, which I don't think that I have at that capacity in a long time.
Pardeep, what sticks with you after watching that with us?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Shannon. I just think just how much of a spiritual challenge it is to get outside of our comfort zones and not think about it in binary terms of either I'm racist or I'm not, and accept that we all have these implicit biases, and that the more that we work in the systems and these systems have power over somebody else's life, the more work that we need to do within those systems to make sure that we're ensuring dignity for everyone. And I think for us, the Interfaith Conference, it really is a spiritual challenge for us and all of our faith communities to be more inclusive.
And when you talk about the spiritual challenge, it also has a physical challenge, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would. I think just the physical challenges is that we all sometimes can get into group mentalities, and just doing that work, making sure that we are walking the space and understanding that this work is respecting somebody else's personhood, and when we start to veer too much away from that, then I think that we should be really challenging what we're believing.
Shalina, if this is something that people want to get better at, this is not the end of the journey. You don't get to watch 50 minutes of television and become better overnight. Talk to me about how you'd like to see people take a journey from here.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty brilliant that Dr. Marks gave some great homework and insight on how to really check your implicit bias. But I think it really has such a strong connection to the biases that we choose to have every day. And we talk about change behavior, that there are some things that I believe even start externally when we start creating new habits of how we interact with people, and even having these negative thoughts and choosing to be like, hey, that does not belong there. And so it really starts with a challenge with self. At True School, it's hip hop, so everybody belongs. And so the idea of the culture of you are creative, everybody comes in vulnerable because you're learning a skill, you're mastering it, you're creating your identity. And then that community is built around achievement and success and lifting one another up. I'm lucky enough to experience this on a regular basis with the youth and the families and the community I'm in. And we get to see in real time young people pick up a different way to connect with each other rather than, finding ways to be different and disassociated.
All right, we're going to pause our conversation right there. Shalina Ali, Pardeep Kalika, thank you for joining us.
And we're not done yet. Coming up on TMJ4 News at 10, a grandfather who says this past summer's protest helped him see his own biases. Now he's trying to reform his racist ways and help bring change in his own communities.
And we're bringing our roundtable conversation over to our digital platforms. Join us right now on the TMJ4 News Facebook page and our streaming app on Apple TV, Amazon, and your Roku devices.
Hidden bias or implicit bias is an unconscious reaction to a person or a group of people which affects how we think and behave.
Tonight, we've been taking an in-depth look at what it is and what we can all do to help combat the bias we may carry.
Now we're joined by local experts on race and equity, Shalina Ali from True School and Pardeep Kalika with the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee.
And Dr. Kwaku Smith, he's a licensed psychologist. Thank you all for joining us.
We'll start the question with you, Dr. Smith. Can you talk personally about how implicit bias has impacted your life?
Yeah, you know what? I think one of the things, being a black man growing up in America, you can obviously see it against you. But I like to kind of start it on a different thing. I read a book or a white paper by a lady named Peggy McIntosh, and she was talking about how do we unpack this white privilege. And I remember being in graduate school, and she was a white lady, and I was like, yes, give it to them, let them know how they're wrong, how they've been doing these things. But then what I didn't know is that she was a feminist, and when she started to talk about the advantages of male privilege, and then I saw how I was so contradictory, how I was so hypocritical in my own terms. What it did, it really opened my eyes to see, like, I could be at the same time a victim and a victimizer. So what implicit bias is for me is to recognize that even though I can be the one who's hurt and then I can scream that out, I also have to be aware of the way that I can take advantage of a situation and be the same thing that's being done to me that I don't like.
Pardeep, let's play off what he said right there, that everybody can play two roles here.
I think we just, we have privilege in certain situations, and I think that coming to the realization that we have certain privileges, and the sooner you realize it, the sooner you can utilize it, and the more that you spend denying it, I think that gets in the way of actually doing the work. So, yeah, Dr. Smith is brilliant, Selena is brilliant. I think this is just a discussion that we need to have at every single level, and I think that Dr. Smith brings up a great point of this is also a mental health a voyage and journey. So,
Shalina, so how do we check ourselves, right? Because if we all have these biases, how do we check ourselves at the door when it rises up?
Great question. I want to go back to being a young girl before I would understand what those words meant, and remembering what it felt like to deeply care for people and watch bad things happen to them. And that could be like your siblings, somebody you're kin to, but also that was like in school, or, that kid that got bullied and there was something in you that was like, that doesn't feel right. And so how sometimes that explicit bias that we need to check is sometimes societal pressure. It's that pressure to go ahead and point out people's differences or to connect with people based on the way that we're disconnected to others. So we have to start developing an understanding that really starts from our most innate emotion, and that is love. And then we have to be actively knowing that when we can check our explicit bias, our implicit bias, I do believe we'll have a chance to flourish in a different direction.
Let's talk about what we just watched for a little bit. Dr. Marks used the term positive contact, talking about people need to get out there and meet people who are not like them so they can learn what other people's experiences are like. How do we do that here in Southeast Wisconsin? This is one of the most segregated cities in the country. The suburbs have the majority of the white population. The city has the majority of the people of color. How do we have that positive contact when geographically we are set up in such a segregated fashion? Pardeep, I'll start with you on this.
Yeah, I think just challenging ourselves to get outside of our comfort zones, to get outside of our neighborhoods, to get outside of our education facility systems. We spend a lot of time at our corporations. I think that building inclusive environments means that you embrace all of somebody. Recent discussions we've been having with people is how do we embrace people's faiths? And that's a part of their life. That's part of their being. So, one thing is educating ourselves. We have the internet. We have the ability to learn from a person's standpoint. But the other thing is just asking them, meeting people where they are rather than what you want to intellectualize about the other person. And I do think that it is a challenge, but it's not some insurmountable challenge that we face in Milwaukee. And then as we go forward, we are becoming more diverse. There are more people moving to cities and urban areas. You look at Michigan and Milwaukee, and you're seeing lots of just immigrants from other countries moving there, and us having the need to really embrace the culture and cultural agility.
Shalina, you're in the business of promoting hip hop culture. How do you bring that culture and what it means to a diverse audience? How do you get that out of the city and into the suburbs so people, I'll just say it, so white people can understand what it is?
I'm so glad you said it, so I didn't have to. First of all, hip hop. So when we're talking hip hop, we're talking about redefining things in language. We don't need to continue to regurgitate the language that actually created the the construct that has led to the segregation. Our city was designed under a racial context to divide us quite intentionally. So let's stop calling us segregated. Let's start talking about how we are inclusive. Downtown is where True School is, and that helps us to serve youth from both sides of the city, all across the spectrum, to honor all cultures. And so you see and you hear that diversity within the context of the art, our social media, and things like that. We have public events and we have programming that is open to everybody. But, you know, if you're not closely associated to us and you can't necessarily come down to True School, then watch the social media, look at the art that's being created, feel the vibes of the music, the vibrancy of the art, and love it. Just freely love it and allow it to resonate with you, even if it didn't come from your specific community.
I love how you say, let's stop using the word segregation and start using the word inclusion. I heard someone talk about courage, and I think that's what needs to happen in this conversation, is that there needs to be courage from people to get out of their comfort zones. And it doesn't have to be the suburbs to Milwaukee. It's right in Milwaukee that the courage starts, and that courage doesn't have to be loud or strong. Kwaku, talk about how you've been able to see from your vantage point how people are intersecting to be more inclusive.
Yeah, I think, you know, when what happened with George Floyd, I think was one of the turning points. You know, we talk about these moments in time, and it was a cry out when George Floyd called out for his mother. And you saw a lot of ladies from different areas across the world. And they said when he called for his mother, that was a call for mothers across the world. And that united us on a level of humanity. And I think once we get back to the basis of what we do, that's everything. When we get back to the art of love, as Shalina talked about, when we get to the art of who we are, the essence of human beings, that allow us not to see those things that we talk about, that xenophobia, the fear of the unknown, hearing the propaganda, those things. But when you actually saw people coming out marching, you saw more white people in the beginning than you saw black people. And then what happened is a lot of the things that people thought that they had heard, they recognized, guess what? All of these different things, these stereotypes that I believed, that I thought, they weren't as true as I did. And guess what? These are some good people inside of here. And what you have to recognize is this: once we do, as Deep said, step outside of our comfort zone, most of the time we'll be surprised. It just takes people to have that courage and then that motivation. Unfortunately, George Floyd was the motivation. The key now is, what can we do to have a positive motivation so it can be around the spirit of love from the beginning?
How do you keep those allies engaged? I mean, they were on the streets last summer. We saw them everywhere, communities all across Southeast Wisconsin. How do we keep those communities engaged to help bridge the divide?
I think just keeping people engaged. You know, when I think about the work that Selena does with art, and the work that Kwaku does with mental health, and the work that we do with spiritual health, we need to understand that we all have a role in this. We all build this world, and we all build this foundation of empathy. And what we want to do in the United States is really, as Dr. Smith talked about, when George Floyd called out to his mom, it was that universal language of empathy and love and understanding and compassion. And that spoke to people at such a core level. So I think that what we need to do is stop talking to minds and start talking to hearts. And for us, building love, building understanding, and sometimes, and you don't have to, I mean, we don't have to change the world. Just, I mean, each relationship that you have in front of you is changing the world. So I think don't be mistaken in that you have to do all of this work, but just reach the one that's in front of you.
That's so true. Let's talk about something that I thought was extremely interesting that Dr. Marks talked about, and that was balance of exposure. Most people now are consuming much of their information on social media. And, you know, I don't want to take us out of this conversation, but how has media played a role in fostering people's hidden bias, and what can we do to be better? Anyone can jump in on this one.
Well, I don't want to take up too much, but what social media does, Facebook does, Twitter does, you can ask them, and they basically algorithm confirmation bias to you. So they're algorithming what you already know, and unless you deliberately challenge that and doubt yourself, you're not going to get out of that. So it's just a way of feeding you what you already know, what you already like, what you already share, and then going further and further and further until you get to the point of saying, hey, I'm looking at the same people all the time. And so social media really, I mean, we're more divisive than we've been in past years. So to get back to that center, we're really going to need to challenge and doubt that what we know is the actual truth, and start to have a healthy discussion in person.
Yeah, I would like to piggyback off that and just say Pardeep is right. It's that human connection, it's that lived experience, especially at a time with the shutdown around COVID and everybody's at home and we're already experiencing this level of isolation and we're turning to social media. But even the conversation that I might have with somebody on this social media platform is not going to be as authentic and expansive as I'm going to have with somebody on my couch where we're holding each other's well-being accountable. On top of all the different things that are being thrown in our faces, as Pardeep said, the algorithms and making sure that we're seeing particular versions of stories over and over again, and then without even the opportunity to process what that means to us and our community in a personal way, is difficult, it's heavy.
The words we say matter. That's one of the things I took away from the program we just watched. And I was struck by one of the examples that Dr. Marks used, talking about something we all learn in school at some point, that we are a nation of immigrants. This is something that struck me. I mean, because those are words that people use casually when talking about the country. It's an innocuous phrase, but he turned it on its ear because it's not the truth. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that moment from the presentation, where something that I assume we all heard in a history class in school: the United States is a melting pot, we're a nation of immigrants, but that's not the truth.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about that is that's one of the ways in which the media can whitewash things, can standardize and deodorize things so you don't see it. Actually, in cultural diversity, what they'll teach you is that there are voluntary immigrants and then there's involuntary immigrants. It's like a nice way of saying, hey, these people, their land was stolen. These people were stolen from their land and brought here in that sense. But when he talks about foreigners, he said, we're all from a different place, but we all have different experiences why we came. And that's why even like within an African community, you may see a person come from Africa and have a completely different experience than a person who's native born here. It all depends on your status. And even for those who are immigrants, it's a big difference between whether you're born, you're second generation, third generation, because people start to assimilate into society. So how you come is such a big difference. But I think the big key is what we want to wrap around our eyes is how the media, and that's the propaganda, to make us think that this is a beautiful society, how they want to take away 1619 report and then add the 1776. What they want to say is this is really what we want you to believe, instead of seeing the truth, because the truth is not beautiful. But as we've all said in this line, unless we're really willing to face the truth, we're never going to make any substantial progress.
That's right. And that goes back to that language. What language are we using? Because the other part of that is, even for those who are not receiving that glorified message, the other part is we're only hearing one part of the story. What I appreciated so much was him breaking down how different groups were impacted, and how it really, it wasn't just one thing that happened. It was a process to get to where we are. And so really just hearing it from that perspective, hearing somebody tell the whole story, it made me smile, to be honest, because I'm like, yes, say it. Thank you. Because that helps us to feel related to each other and feel connected.
And I think the miseducation, as you know, Steve, you even said it. You said this is something that was taught to us. But if we don't challenge what is taught to us and look to see that it's a diverse educational system, then you'll believe what is told to you.
Right.
I guess the other question I have is, though, in the media, because social media is one thing. There's no one kind of there's no code of ethics on social media, where journalism has a code of ethics that we must follow. I want to know how we as an organization can do better to have a more balanced exposure of the communities that we serve.
You know, I think we start really back here in Wisconsin, and we go back in times of antiquity to McCarthy and McCarthyism. I think he was the pre-runner of far seeing different things that was so outlandish, and the media had to say, do we just say what a person says, or do we really fact check this? Do we really say, before we're going to put this out here and get these ratings, that we're really going to make sure we're putting information that's factual and that's actual? So when I think about the media and I think about the standards they have, obviously it's a commercial business too. You want to make sales, sensationalism sales, but it has to come down to the point of, what are we willing to do? And I think that's why some stations, if we're just being absolutely honest, like a PBS NewsHour has a distinct advantage over corporate news, because they can be very objective, where you see other stations, though they may try to be, you can see the biases within them.
You know, the book that we recommended, Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, talks a lot about propaganda and talks about how each, takes apart three different caste systems in India, Nazi Germany, and the Americas. And sometimes when we start towards that place of dehumanization, propaganda is a huge part of that. You would look at a lot of genocides that have been created or that have happened over the years, and you will see propaganda. So we all have responsibility, and within media or mass media or journal media, we have to know that when we carry power to change hearts and minds, that we have a certain responsibility, and that responsibility should be to preserve the dignity of communities and people and personhood. And if we start to veer too much off of that, I think we need to start to come back and say, okay, like what is it we're saying, and what kind of effect is it having on people? And I think it's all of our jobs to address the spiritual health of Milwaukee, Metro Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the world that we all exist in.
We asked our viewers on our TMJ4 Facebook page what questions they had about implicit bias. We got this question from Mike. He wants to know, how does racial bias affect our judicial system? Let's go on this one. Let's take some time chewing on this. Let's start with Kwaku.
Yeah, so obviously, when we look at something like the prison industrial complex, we look no more further than Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I grew up in 53206, so I don't like how it's represented because that's not how it was when I grew up. But now, today, we understand that to be the most incarcerated zip code in the United States, which makes this the most incarcerated zip code in the world. And when we see the disproportionate number of people specifically in our prison system, black and brown. And then not only that, you go into young people and then you go into those within low SES. You see how the prison industrial complex is built upon taking advantage of those people who have been marginalized, ostracized, and easy, as Pardeep said, easily to dehumanize and be able to justify doing those things when we recognize that prison systems, the correctional system was built to rehabilitate. And when we see people come in, become institutionalized, and come out worse, we have to ask ourselves why. And then when we see who's constantly being put in, and then we look at the economic benefits from some others, you have to wonder why. And when we look at anything inside of the system, you always say, as Cornel West said in his most famous book in 1993, race matters, because that is the quickest and easiest way to segregate people.
Anyone else want to weigh in on how the justice system plays a role?
Dr. Kwaku put it down. So.
All right. That's fine. Let's talk about, I always want to make sure that we give people something to give them hope and to go forward with. And I know that each one of you guys are well read. So I kind of asked you, tell me 2 books that you think would really help our viewers to lean into this conversation and do the work that needs to be done. Shalina, what would be your book recommendations?
The first one is The Biology of Belief, and that is by Bruce Lipton. And one of the reasons for that is it kind of myth busts the idea that we're born with certain genes, like we have to have certain cancers or diabetes and things like that, where really it's behavior and environment that influences that. So from generation to generation, if our environment is not improving and if our behavior is not evolving, that is how we actually tend to have a lot of the generational things that happen. Our birthright is not to be at a deficit. It's quite the opposite. And so when we change our mentality around that and we behave differently, we start to see a shift in our own lives, which has a direct impact in the future generation. The other book is The Tao of Wu, written by RZA. And just in the base of hip hop being something that challenges you to deconstruct everything you thought you knew, to rebuild yourself into what you want to be. And especially, Wu-Tang is greatly influenced by Asian culture. And I was like, how did we get there? And how does this all connect? And that book allows you to understand how one culture can love another culture and still have love for themselves and be able to see how that synergy can really be a great, can create great chemistry for growth and understanding.
Awesome. Dr. Smith, what books do you recommend people read?
Okay, so the first one is Carter G. Woodson, coming off the backdrop of Black History Month, he being the creator of Negro History Week. I believe in this book, it goes back to what you said earlier, Shannon, the miseducation. So how do we re-educate ourselves to make sure that we are doing what? That we educate ourselves properly. That means challenging the status quo, challenging the propaganda. When we hear that Columbus discovered America, to be able to say, guess what? I don't think you can discover a land that's been here. But on top of this, what I love about Carter G. Woodson's book is that he then challenges the Negro, the Black person of that time, to say, look and see how you've been propagandized, and then you become complicit in your own oppression. So I think that's a masterful book to read, not only for Black people, but for other people to see how they might even marginalize within group. And then the second book is The Soul of America by John Meacham. And what I love about this, one of the best lines in this book, he said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. It's a quote from Mark Twain. And when I thought about that, he goes in to talk about how what we're seeing today has been done throughout the course of United States American history. So we can't say, hey, we've never been here before. This is not us. This is not who we are. What he's saying is just, this is who we are. This is the foundation. And what he talks about is how do our better angels then begin to be to defeat those demons. And when I think about a person who can say, how can my better angels defeat my those demons? I gotta sneak and get out one more book, and that's The Gift of Our Wounds from my man Pardeep. I can't get it out, but I'm gonna get it out before you go, because when I look at The Gift of Our Wounds, I think of what it takes for America to go. I think of somebody like Pardeep, and I don't say this because he's on the line, but this man has a heart of forgiveness that the average person can't. And if we're really going to get to the next level of how do we forgive, how do we heal, we have to have an extraordinary level of love, of forgiveness. And Pardeep shows that.
Most definitely. Pardeep, elevating us even more on this book list that we have. Share with us 2 books you believe will also help people lean in on this conversation.
I'd like to just thank you, Shannon, Steve, Dr. Smith, Selena, and just having this discussion. Talked a little bit about it before. Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, who takes apart just how deeply ingrained some of that is into our psyche, and then Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt, and she goes into the neurobiology of these biases, and I know that Dr. Smith does a phenomenal presentation around. And then, Dr. Smith, I'm gonna, like, for you taught, and Dr. Smith and I were colleagues, and we just are friends outside of this. Selena and I are friends outside of this. And what they have taught me is that sometimes the deepest, most sincerest form of love is understanding. And sometimes that's understanding for somebody else, and a lot of times it's understanding of ourselves. And so allow yourself the ability to make mistakes and understand that you can do that, and we can have these conversations, and we can go forward together. So thank you so much again.
Love and understanding, 2 human things we all can do, right?
Let's make our last question about that. This is a process that people will go on as they learn to address their bias and move through it. Nobody's perfect, though. How do we deal with people who are making an effort but fall short sometimes? How do we help them through?
I think we make room for them to forgive themselves, knowing that, there's our lives are an ongoing journey. We are forever learners. We're having new experiences. We're going through things by design, or things are happening to us. And so just beginning with needing to give people space to grow and get better, and for us to genuinely hold that love for ourselves, because we're part of that population that needs that, and then just extending that to everybody else. I think that's an important part. Every day is a new opportunity to have the best day ever.
Pardeep, your turn.
I think just, forgiveness, and then thinking about sometimes forgiveness, a lot of times it's equated to being forgiveness for somebody else. But allowing that forgiveness to say, okay, you know what, forgiveness for you might be this difficult relationship that you had with this person, and now you need to let them go. Forgiveness might be saying, okay, you know what, what's happening within me when I have this conversation. So I think that the recipe towards forgiveness is this recipe towards freedom, and it's a process, and not necessarily a destination, but definitely just that's got to be part of that process.
Dr. Smith, take us home.
Yeah, I think we've been saying the word love all night, and I think that's a beautiful thing. But if we look on the opposite end of that spectrum, we hear the word hate. And when we hear the word hate, what I want people to think is this: that's an emotion and that we're going to have. But what I want people to understand is this: it's about hating the right thing. So hate injustice, hate people being marginalized, hate people being brutalized, hate seeing the wrong thing. And then that anger, that fear that you have, that emotion you have with that, use that to fight against those things. Do something that you didn't think you normally would do. Fight for somebody who you said you normally wouldn't fight. We can all fight for people who look like us and that's within us. But when we fight for people outside of our comfort zone, I think that's when something great happens.
We're going to leave it on that word right there. I don't think it can get any better than that. Not to take anything away from Shalina Ali or Pardeep Kalika, but Dr. Smith, you brought it home. Thank you so much for sharing your time tonight for this important conversation.
And we also want to thank you, the viewers, for joining us tonight. Good night.